A man picks up a telephone in his summer house on the Black Sea, and the line is dead. He tries another line, and another, and the internal line to the kitchen, and the line for the staff. Every telephone in the house has gone silent within the same minute. It is 4:30 on a Sunday afternoon in August 1991, and the man trying the phones is the President of the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was running out of things. The shops in Moscow had been short of goods for years, but the shortages were becoming acute. There were weeks when the meat counters held nothing at all, and the queues for bread began before dawn. Inflation had broken the ruble. Wages a worker collected in the morning had lost much of their value by evening. The state had been borrowing to feed itself for most of a decade, and the foreign creditors were beginning to ask questions the government could not answer. 6 years earlier, in 1985, a younger man had taken over the Communist Party, determined to fix what he could see was failing. Mikhail Gorbachev was the first Soviet leader born after the Bolshevik Revolution, and the first to look at the system he had inherited and decide it had to be reformed rather than maintained. He introduced two ideas the Russian language had not previously needed words for: glasnost, openness, let people speak about the country honestly, including about its history. Perestroika, restructuring, was meant to loosen the central economic controls that had calcified since Stalin. What Gorbachev did not anticipate was that loosening one part of the system would loosen all of it. The republics felt the loosening first. They were a federation of 15 on paper, with a constitution that promised the right of secession and a Russian-led empire in practice, where any republic that tested that promise had been crushed. Once people were allowed to talk about that openly, the conversation moved quickly. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990, the first of the republics to do so. On the night of the 13th of January 1991, Soviet airborne troops were sent to retake the Vilnius television tower. 14 unarmed Lithuanians died in the snow defending it. Estonia and Latvia, watching what had happened in Vilnius, built barricades around their own parliaments and waited. Whoever in the Kremlin had given that order in January would not give one again. The Baltic republics were leaving, and the only question was when. In June 1991, the Russian Republic, the largest of all of them, held its first popular election for president. Boris Yeltsin won outright with around 57% of the vote. He defeated the candidate Gorbachev had quietly preferred and took office as the first popularly elected leader in Russian history. Yeltsin was no longer prepared to wait for Moscow's permission. The country now had two presidents, one elected by the Congress of People's Deputies, the partly democratic Soviet parliament, the other chosen directly by the Russian people. Only one of those mandates carried weight in a society that was rapidly working out what democracy meant. Gorbachev's answer to all of this was a new agreement. The new Union Treaty was scheduled to be signed in Moscow on the 20th of August 1991. It would have transformed the Soviet Union into something looser, a federation of independent republics with a common president, a common foreign policy, and a common army. Everything else would have been handed to the republics themselves. Gorbachev believed it was the only path that could hold the country together. The men who ran the Soviet state's coercive apparatus, KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev, Defense Ministry Dmitry Yazov, Interior Minister Boris Pugo, believed it would do the opposite. To them, the treaty was the instrument that would dismantle the country they had spent their careers serving. They could not let it be signed. On the 17th of August 1991, 8 of them met at a KGB guest house on the outskirts of Moscow. They had a copy of the treaty in front of them, and they read it carefully. Then they decided to act. The next afternoon, 4 members of the group flew to the Black Sea coast of Crimea, where Gorbachev was on holiday at his dacha at Foros. They told him he had a choice. He could declare a state of emergency himself and hand his powers to Vice President Gennady Yanayev for the duration, or he could resign and let Yanayev take them without his signature. Gorbachev refused both. The delegation flew back to Moscow that evening and began assembling the documents that would be broadcast at 6 o'clock the next morning. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 19th of August 1991, Soviet citizens turned on their televisions and saw Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Between performances, an announcer read a statement from a state committee on the state of emergency, the GKCHP, which most viewers had never heard of. The president, the announcer said, was unable to perform his duties due to ill health. Vice President Gennady Yanayev had assumed his powers. A state of emergency would last 6 months, with strikes, demonstrations, and most newspapers banned. Then the music resumed. Outside the studios, columns of armoured vehicles were already moving into central Moscow. By the time the announcement finished, the army was in the city. Roughly 4,000 soldiers, 350 tanks, 300 armoured personnel carriers, and 420 trucks had been deployed. They took positions around the Kremlin, the parliament buildings, the central television tower at Ostankino, and the bridges across the Moskva River. It was the largest deployment of force in the streets of the Soviet capital in living memory. The plotters had not arrested Boris Yeltsin. He had returned from a trip to Kazakhstan 2 days earlier and was at his dacha in the village of Arkhangelskoye, 20 miles outside Moscow. Twice the KGB had considered detaining him, once at the airport, once at the dacha, and had not done it on either occasion. Alpha Group, the elite special forces unit that handled this kind of operation, was in the woods around the property when the morning announcement was broadcast. The order to move never came. Group Commander Viktor Karpukin claimed afterwards that the order had been given and that he had disobeyed it. Other accounts suggested the order was never given at all. At 9 o'clock, Yeltsin drove out of the dacha gates with his bodyguards crowded around him in the back seat because he had refused to wear a vest. He was on his way to the Russian White House. The White House, the Russian Parliament building, was a vast white marble complex on the embankment of the Moskva. It was the only piece of state authority in Moscow that still answered to Yeltsin. By 11 o'clock, he was inside it. He was on the phone, dictating an appeal to the Russian people. The legally elected president of the country, the appeal began, has been unlawfully suspended from his duty. It called what was happening a state coup, called for a general strike, and asked Russians to defend their constitutional government. At 10 minutes to 1, Yeltsin walked out of the parliament building. A column of T-72 tanks from the Tamanskaya division was parked in the square in front of it, and a crowd of perhaps 1,000 civilians had gathered around them. Yeltsin climbed into the lead tank, the very vehicle that had been deployed to threaten him, and read the appeal aloud. The image went around the world that afternoon. It also reached the soldiers in the tanks who had not been told what they were doing in Moscow and were beginning to find out from the civilians around them. At 5 in the afternoon, the State Committee held a press conference. Yanayev sat at a long table in front of 7 of his fellow plotters and tried to explain to the country what had happened that morning. He was visibly nervous. Sweat showed through his suit. His hands trembled on the green baize of the table, and his voice slurred slightly when he spoke. Yanayev told the journalists that his friend, President Gorbachev, was very tired and was being treated in the south, and that he hoped Gorbachev would eventually return to his post. None of this was reassuring. But the moment that broke the press conference was not anything Yanayev said. A young Soviet journalist stood up and asked a question. Her name was Tatyana Malkina. She was 24 years old, and she worked for the new independent newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta. She asked the men at the table whether they understood that they had just carried out a state coup. The question was broadcast live across the country. Nobody at the table had an answer. By the time the press conference ended, the crowd outside the White House was several thousand strong and growing. People were dragging trolley buses across the embankment to make barricades. Workers from nearby factories arrived with chunks of railroad track and reinforcing rod. Mothers were bringing food and cigarettes for the soldiers and asking them, in the way that babushkas ask difficult questions in any country, whether they would really fire on their own grandsons. The conscripts in the tanks did not know how to answer that any more than the men at the press conference had known how to answer Tatyana Malkina. By midnight on the first day of the coup, several thousand civilians were inside the perimeter the army had been ordered to enforce, and nobody had given the order to clear them. By the morning of the 20th of August, the crowd at the White House had grown to perhaps 50,000 people. It had doubled by the afternoon. By the evening, 200,000 civilians stood in concentric rings around the Parliament building. Some had brought tents. Others were carrying children, or food, or the metal poles that were going into the next round of barricades. Among them was Mstislav Rostropovich, the cellist, who had flown in from Paris that morning to stand with the defenders. He slept in the corridors of the White House that night beside a Kalashnikov he did not know how to use. The plotters announced a curfew that would take effect at 11. The attack on the White House was planned for the night. What the men in the Kremlin did not see, because they were watching the wrong city, was what was happening in Tallinn. On the afternoon of the 20th of August, while the curfew was being announced in Moscow, the Estonian Supreme Council was meeting in the Parliament building above Toompea Hill. By a vote of 69-0, the deputies passed the resolution restoring the full independence of the Republic of Estonia. The vote was technically about resuming a sovereignty that, in their reading, had never been legally surrendered in 1940. But the practical meaning was simpler. Estonia was no longer a Soviet republic. The Soviet response was a column of airborne troops sent to take the Tallinn TV tower, which sat on a hill outside the city and was the country's only link to international broadcasting. Estonian volunteers, most of them unarmed, surrounded the building. They had been preparing for this since the night the Lithuanians had died in the snow. Their tower was not going to fall the same way. They held the perimeter. The Soviet troops, who had been told they were dealing with criminals, were faced instead with a crowd singing the Estonian national anthem in the dark. Riga had spent the previous 8 months behind concrete barricades built in the days after the snow at Vilnius. The defenders of the parliament had not gone home, and Latvian radio was reporting their progress to the country in real time. On the 21st of August, while the fighting in Moscow was still being decided, the Latvian Supreme Council passed the constitutional law that confirmed its declaration of independence as the final law of the country. A republic that had spent 50 years inside the Soviet Union was simply, formally, leaving it. The plotters in Moscow gave no sign of having noticed. Late that same night, between the 21st of August and the small hours of the 22nd, a column of Tamanskaya Division armoured vehicles was moving through the streets of central Moscow. The crew did not know exactly where they were going. The civilians in the streets believed the column was on its way to the White House. At a tunnel where the Garden Ring Road passes underneath the Novi Arbat thoroughfare, a crowd blocked the column with trolleybuses and street cleaning machines, and began climbing onto the vehicles to cover the driver's observation slits. One of the men in the crowd was Dmitry Komar, 22 years old, a paratrooper who had served in Afghanistan and now worked at a furniture factory in the town of Istra outside Moscow. When he climbed onto the lead armoured vehicle to cover the driver's slit, the vehicle lurched. He did not get back up. 2 other men were killed trying to help him, Vladimir Yusov, a 37-year-old economist, and Ilya Krichevsky, a 28-year-old architect, both shot in the confusion that followed. Yeltsin would later ask their families to forgive him for not being able to prevent their deaths. Their names appear on every memorial that has been built to the coup since. The deaths broke whatever was left of the plot. Defense Minister Yazov, watching the reports come in from his office at the Defense Ministry, ordered the troops out of Moscow at 5 o'clock the next morning. Alpha Group had already refused a second order to storm the White House. The Tamanskaya tank crews around the parliament had begun turning their turrets away from the building during the night. By the afternoon of the 21st of August, KGB Chief Khrushchev was on the phone to Yeltsin, telling him the State Committee had agreed to release Gorbachev. By the evening, the plotters themselves were on a plane to Crimea to negotiate their own surrender. 60 hours after the Swan Lake announcement, the coup was over. Estonia and Latvia were independent. Lithuania, which had been independent on paper since the year before, was now independent in fact, because the Soviet state had used its last available card and lost. 3 days later, the Ukrainian parliament would declare its own independence in Kyiv, and from that moment, no version of the Soviet Union worth saving was still possible. The plotters had spent 60 hours trying to take control of the capital of a country that had been leaving in pieces for 2 years. They had succeeded only in giving the last republics permission to finish. Gorbachev landed in Moscow at 1 a.m. on the 22nd of August. Later that day, he gave a press conference. He still spoke of the Communist Party as a progressive force and said he intended to purge it of the reactionary elements that had betrayed him. His expectation, he made clear, was to return to the position he had held 3 days earlier. Almost nobody in the room agreed with him. The country he had left was not the country he had come back to. The Communist Party that had ruled the Soviet Union for 74 years had been complicit in trying to remove him, and was no longer something it was politically possible to defend. 2 days later, on the 24th of August, he resigned as its general secretary. The men around him were already beginning to die or fall. On the morning of the 22nd of August, Boris Pugo, the interior minister and one of the 8 plotters, was found dead in his apartment. His wife was beside him. Both had taken their own lives. Marshal Sergei Akromeyev, who had been Gorbachev's chief military advisor and had supported the State Committee from a distance, was found dead in his Kremlin office 2 days later. He had also taken his own life. That same evening, a crowd in front of the KGB headquarters at Lubyanka Square pulled down the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet secret police. The statue had stood there since 1958. It came off its plinth without resistance from the building it had guarded for 33 years. The republics did not wait for Gorbachev's permission. On the 24th of August, Ukraine declared its independence. Belarus declared its sovereignty the next day. Moldova, Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan followed by the end of the month. Soviet recognition of the independence of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania came on the 6th of September. 8 months after the snow at Vilnius, the Soviet state had given in. Through autumn, the rest of the republics held their own votes or made their own declarations. The most consequential of those votes came on the 1st of December, when the Ukrainian people were asked in a referendum whether they confirmed the parliament's August Declaration of Independence. They voted yes by 92%. After that referendum, the union was finished. Ukraine was gone, and the country could not survive without it. On the 8th of December 1991, 3 men met at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest on the border between Belarus and Poland. Boris Yeltsin came from Moscow, Leonid Kravchuk from Kyiv as the new president of independent Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich was the host as chairman of the Belarusian parliament. They drafted, and that evening signed, a single short document. The Soviet Union, it said, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, had ceased to exist. A successor body called the Commonwealth of Independent States was created to manage what was left. Then they made a phone call. The first call did not go to Gorbachev. It went to George Bush in Washington. Gorbachev's last public act came on the evening of the 25th of December. It was Christmas Day in much of the world, though not in Russia. In a televised address from the Kremlin, he resigned the presidency of a country that no longer existed in international law and was about to be formally dissolved. He spoke for 12 minutes, and he did not weep. The red flag on the Kremlin Senate was lowered shortly after he finished and replaced with the white-blue-red flag of the Russian Federation. There was no ceremony, and almost no one watching had been told it was happening. In Washington, George Bush addressed the American people later that evening to declare that the Cold War was over. 500 miles to the north, in the city that had been called Leningrad until a few months earlier and was now called St. Petersburg again, the deputy mayor was watching all of this from the office he had taken when he left the KGB. He was 39 years old. His name was Vladimir Putin. During the years of Glasnost, he had been in East Germany watching the Berlin Wall come down from the inside of a foreign intelligence station. Now he had returned home to a Soviet Union that no longer trusted itself. During the coup itself, he had stood with the mayor on the steps of the city hall, helping to organize resistance to the State Committee. From those 3 days in August, he had drawn a conclusion that was different from the one Yeltsin had drawn, or the one Gorbachev had drawn, or the one most of his fellow Russians appeared to have drawn. He had concluded that the system had not been wrong, only that the men running it had been weak. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the end of the Soviet Union, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which story we should cover next.